What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Masters of the Universe, and as you can see, since my last video, I've been working on my pectoral muscles just a little bit because I wasn't about to review a He-Man movie without getting fully engorged. Yeah, that's the ticket. That looks good right there. In any case, let's talk about He-Man, the Masters of the Universe, and I'm going to break up this review into non-spoilers and spoilers, and I'll link those time codes below. But because I grew up with these action figures and the cartoon and the first live-action movie, etc., I'm not going to be able to talk about the good, the bad, and the mediocre without making some references to specifics, but let's just start big picture. I didn't hate it. And I didn't really know what to expect going into this because I'd seen some trailers that I liked. I'd seen some trailers that I liked a little less. And I would say this movie, on the whole, is very watchable, at times very enjoyable. And early on in the movie, there were even one or two scenes where I was like, wait a second, am I getting emotionally affected by a fucking Masters of the Universe movie? Where I started getting little bits of chills or hints of chills during some of the opening narration and some of the character introductions. I was like, oh my God, like we really are going back to, when I was 6 years old, when these action figures first dropped on the shelves of Toys R Us.
What do we have here?
It's Castle Grayskull. And it's mine. Not so fast, Beastman. He-Man!
You can pit He-Man against Beastman playing for the power of Castle Grayskull. You have to put the castle together.
And I've got plenty to say about what I think this movie got right and what I think this movie got wrong. But the number one thing I want to say before I say anything else, I think they nailed the casting of He-Man, and that's the most important ingredient. Nicholas Galitzine, I don't know if it's Galitzine or Galitzine. I've heard you're supposed to pronounce his last name like magazine, and Anne Hathaway made some rap out of it. But I was caught off guard by just how charismatic he was and what a great leading man he was. He looks great. He's a very funny dude. He's a very charming dude. He looks good in action. You can tell he spent a lot of hours in the gym getting prepared for this role. And you can see in the behind-the-scenes footage how hard he was working on the choreography. So while I've got plenty of complaints about this movie, first and foremost, He-Man, they got right, and I'd be more than happy to watch him again as He-Man if they ever make another movie. And I really don't even have any choice in the matter because I was born in 1976. I was part of that initial target audience. I was primed and ready just to eat this shit up. And I can remember this like it happened yesterday, but I was sitting in kindergarten class and this kid brought an action figure to school for show and tell, as we did back in the early 80s, because suddenly there was just this tidal wave of all these action figures. But the kid brought Beastman to school. I took one look at it and I was like, all right, that is the coolest fucking thing I have ever seen. And it wasn't that much longer before I managed to persuade my mother to take me to Toys R Us, and I started building a little collection of my own. And basically from like kindergarten through third grade, Masters of the Universe was one of the most important things that ever happened to me, alongside like Marvel Comics or discovering stand-up arcade games or D&D, but like there was a lot of really, really cool, fun pop culture for kids in the early to mid-'80s, and Masters of the Universe was a huge part of that. And I'll get into a little more granular detail about the early days of the franchise in the latter part of the video, but if over the course of this video I express a few strong opinions that are either positive, negative, or anywhere in between, you'll know where I'm coming from because I was a day one OG fan of this incredible fictional setting. But it must be said that since the great heyday of Masters of the Universe, which basically lasted from like 1982 to 1986, there have been many attempts to resurrect the popularity of this franchise with action figures, with cartoons, with live action movies, like you name it. There have been, for the last 40 years, people have been trying to recapture the magic that made it such a cultural phenomenon in the early mid-'80s when they were like, selling $400 million in plastic every year off the toy shelves, a figure which collapsed down to about $7 million by 1987. All of it is captured in the two fantastic documentaries about the history of this franchise. Power of Grayskull from 2018, which I believe you can see on Tubi, and an episode of the Netflix series, The Toys That Made Us. I think it's like episode 2 or 3 of the first season. But if you want to hear about the boom and bust cycle of Masters of the Universe and the subsequent attempts to resurrect it, well, those documentaries got you covered. I absolutely love them to pieces, and I rewatched them in preparation for this video. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let's focus on the most recent iteration of Masters of the Universe. This movie directed by Travis Knight, whose previous credits include Kubo and the Two Strings, a pretty good animated movie up until it basically falls to pieces, and Bumblebee, which was more or less a successful attempt at resurrecting interest in the Transformers at that time, which is probably why he got tapped to do this. Like, all right, he made people like Transformers again with Bumblebee and kind of reminded them, at least with that initial scene, what it was all about. Maybe he can do the same with Masters of the Universe. Here's my prediction. I think Masters of the Universe is going to play more or less pretty well with people from like age 45 to 55 who remember fondly that era in the 1980s where between the commercials and the comic books and the action figures and the animated show by Filmation and all that stuff, the people who remember that era with great nostalgia, they're going to have fun with this. They're going to intensely debate the pros and cons and the Easter eggs and all that good stuff. I'm not entirely convinced this movie is going to play all that well with like 5-year-old or 6-year-old children, which was the intended audience back in the day. If you watch the old school episodes of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, they're pretty innocent. There were some very strict guidelines back then about the portrayal of violence. When you watch the show, you're like, is He-Man ever actually going to like stab anybody or punch somebody or do anything? It's mostly like, oh, let's throw Beastman into the bog, or oh, let's spin somebody and make a silly sound as we push them away. It's very innocent. What people remember is that killer fucking theme song and that awesome intro. It's iconic.
And the Masters of the Universe.
Well, long story short, between the figures and the show, it was geared toward a very, very young sensibility. So the question now is, how do you make a movie that'll appeal to adults that remember that era fondly, but also at the same time might potentially rope in a new generation of little kids? And I don't know if they're entirely successful, because the movie, while at times it provides some very solid escapism with some very colorful characters, some really entertaining music, a great setting, and it's been described as the kitchen sink setting because you can put any character into it and it'll work. It doesn't matter if it's like hardcore dark adult fantasy or like high tech with like tanks and like, you know, robots and that sort of thing. Like sci-fi or fantasy perfectly come together in Masters of the Universe. Probably better than any other franchise that's ever been cooked up at any other time in history. Even like Star Wars, where it has a bit of like the supernatural and magic kind of mixed in with the sci-fi, it more or less is a sci-fi setting. Masters of the Universe, whether you have a sword and shield or a laser gun, it all somehow goes together, which is how they kind of got into trouble with the action figures later on, because there wasn't a really clear rule book or guide to the setting about which characters fit and which characters don't. But once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. But with this new movie, throughout the screening, which I saw in IMAX this evening, I heard a lot of middle-aged men, you know, like high-fiving and like screaming with pleasure and having a good old time. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if this movie struggles to find a brand new, very young audience. Because first and foremost, the movie's 2 hours and 20 minutes. And in the second half of the movie, it really starts to drag. Like it comes roaring out of the gate with like some really brisk pacing and some good comedy and some good action. I was like, all right, like game on. We're watching Masters of the Universe. But in the latter half of the movie, I was like, ooh, y'all are making some very questionable creative decisions that are prolonging the inevitable. If you're making a movie that you want 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds to enjoy, 90 minutes, and you got to cut yourself off because there are going to be some little kids tugging on their parents' sleeves like, can we get the fuck out of here? Like, this movie is endless. And I think another potential obstacle to this movie appealing to both the very young as well as the very old, they don't quite know which audience they want more. You can tell they're trying to get both, but the movie has a lot of, let's just say, slightly perverted adult humor about, you know, Fisto liking the Fist people, or Ram Man liking the Ram people, or even Skeletor making references to, like, you know, He-Man's long sword hanging between his legs. You're like, all right, I'm 49 years old. I can handle this. Like, I don't necessarily need this kind of humor in a He-Man movie, but I'm a big boy. I know what you're going for, and obviously these jokes write themselves when you have characters like Fisto in your movie. However, if you're trying to build a new franchise like 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds might like for the next 5, 10, 15 years, either, I guess maybe the filmmakers are hoping that the jokes will just fly right over their head, and the kids are like, oh, Fisto, like, you know, they're just being cute. But I imagine there are going to be a lot of parents that look at the kids like, oh, hide their ears and that sort of thing. But the flip side of that is, while you've got all these kind of like, you know, perverted jokes for aging He-Man fans and that sort of thing, the action scenes are definitely geared toward a more young sensibility. Not as young as the original Filmation series from the 1980s, but like, you know, there are a few deaths along the way and people actually do get stabbed. I was actually caught off guard when a few characters got killed. I was like, oh, well, surely they're going to come back before the end of the movie. And I was like, oh, nope. They're not coming back. Wow, this actually includes death, which is just unheard of with the cartoon back in the 1980s.
Keep your fangs to yourself, Beastman.
But in general, this iteration of Masters of the Universe is a brightly colored, lighthearted action-adventure story that's intended to be fun for the whole family, but maybe with the benefit of hindsight, if they wanted to go into kind of the strange sexual terrain of some of the comedy, they might have considered making this movie more of like a dark adult fantasy movie mixed with like some sci-fi, like intended for adults, leaned all the way in on that. And perhaps some kids that are a little bit more open-minded might have come along for the ride, because I feel like right now the movie's too much of different things, but not enough of any one thing. It doesn't quite know which movie it wants to be, which should come as a surprise to nobody who's familiar with the early days of this franchise, where the creators at Mattel were very much inventing this whole fictional setting and these characters on the fly. They were making up as they went along. And every once in a while, they would stumble into really interesting, cool, creative decisions. But the lore wasn't really set or codified for like a year or two until the show started coming out. Because in the early days, when these action figures first started hitting the shelves, they had these little mini comics in the back. And the mini comics and their lore initially were quite different from the lore in the show that came out in 1983. So much so, the very first time in my life where I experienced like fan backlash or pushback was when I saw the show. It was September of 1983. I had just started first grade. I remember I was over at like a friend's house after school, and we were watching it, and we were hell-bent upon seeing this goddamn show. But like up to that point, there had been no Prince Adam action figure. There had been no Orko action figure. And I was like, wait a second, who's Prince Adam? Who's Orko? This feels like it's for babies. Because if you read the original mini comics, He-Man, who was kind of loosely configured around Conan, he came from this like tribe of barbarians, and he wore like, a fur bikini and had a spear. And when he bumped into Tila / the Sorceress, who were kind of the same character back then before they finally were split into two separate characters, but she had green skin back then, but he bumped into her. She gave him a lot of his weapons, and he kind of got him off to the races. But those first few mini comics had a very different tone and very different style, where basically the whole concept of Masters of the Universe in the early days was who has the power to control Castle Grayskull, which is why Skeletor and He-Man came with the two halves of the Power Sword. You put those together, it would unlock the toy set, and basically you could just like play with that play set over and over and over again. He-Man versus Skeletor, or Skeletor versus He-Man and their allies. Who's going to control the castle moving forward? And let me pause to offer a quick shout out to Rudy Obrero, who designed those original boxes for Battle Cat and the Wind Raider, and especially Castle Grayskull. That's some of the best artwork for toys in the history of mankind. And as a little kid, seeing that fucking thing up on the shelf, I mean, it made your imagination explode with all these incredible possibilities. But as you can tell from his art, it's a little darker, it's a little more savage, it's a little more old school kick-ass fantasy as opposed to something for little kids like we saw in the show. But then to make the lore even more complicated, between the introduction of the action figures and the little mini comics in the back and the arrival of the show, DC Comics had a couple iterations of He-Man as well, where they started introducing things like Prince Adam, but once again, the lore wasn't set. But my point in all this is that between the mini comics, the DC Comics, and the animated series, there are contradictions between all those. And this is all like in the span of like the first year or two of this franchise, and so it's always kind of been built on shaky footing, but the characters were so cool, and the music was so cool, and the setting was so outlandish, and the muscles were so big, like you were willing to forgive a lot of inconsistencies at the time, because we were all just having so much fun with these characters, right up to the point where I suddenly and abruptly lost all interest in He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, primarily because G.I. Joe and Transformers started luring me away, and this felt a little bit more kind of age appropriate for like an 8 or 9 year old versus like a 5 or 6 year old. But then I started discovering skateboards and girls and Nintendo, and I was like, oh, action figures. Like we started lighting them on fire, putting firecrackers in them. Like the last thing you would want would be for a girl to come up to your place and see action figures. So you either hid them or destroyed them or threw them away. So by the time the 1987 Canon Films movie came out, I'd completely, totally lost interest. It took me weeks, perhaps even months, to see the thing, and I was like, all right, it's got a few nice moments. I liked Evil Lynn in it. I liked Frank Langella as Skeletor quite a bit. He just goes for it. And there are some scenes in that movie that I like quite a bit and still enjoy watching, but there are quite a few more scenes and quite a few more characters that I outright despise. So by 1987, my interest in Masters of the Universe was shattered for all time, and I don't think this franchise has ever been on firm footing ever since. But this movie, it comes close. It gets right up to the edge of being a successful reboot or reinvention of this 44-year-old franchise for the modern age. A franchise where Amazon can make 2, 3, 4 movies, possibly do spin-off movies involving She-Ra or whatever the case might be. But I don't think this movie's going to be quite successful enough where it's like an obvious slam dunk or like a no-brainer that Amazon should continue with its endeavor. But you might be asking yourself, why are my feelings on this movie so mixed? Why am I presenting like equal parts praise and condemnation for this movie? Let's talk about some of the good ingredients first. Camila Mendes as Tila. I have to say, I liked her quite a bit. And going into this movie, I was worried that perhaps they might make her like, one of those like Star Wars or Marvel type, girl bosses who's completely, totally insufferable. They did not do so with Tila, primarily because she's so fucking pretty that I spent half the movie just like, oh my God, like Tila, you got it going on. I mean, she is hot as fucking shit. So Camila Mendes, even if she just stood there with like that cool Cobra staff from the action figure back when she still had like the Cobra outfit and just praised Adam and He-Man the whole movie, that would have been totally fine. But she looks great in action. She's very athletic. And she's got some good chemistry with Idris Elba, who plays her father, Duncan, a.k.a. Man-at-Arms. So I did like Tila in this movie quite a bit. I also like the score. The soundtrack is another matter. Let's talk about the original score composed by, hang on, got his name right here. Music by Daniel Pemberton. He has a few tunes early on when they're introducing the characters and introducing Attorney. I was like, God damn, dude, like you wrote some good music. But when it comes to the soundtrack, there's some really good needle drops in here. However, they do something to these songs which I absolutely despise. When you take a popular song that people know well and they kind of know the rhythms and they know where the chorus comes, but they chop it up into little pieces to condense it or abbreviate it or to basically change where the climaxes of the song come, because then at that point, I'm distracted by the butchery of a song that I like as opposed to enjoying the song that I love. And the best example of that, and I guess I'm going into very mild spoiler territory here, but Princes of the Universe, a song by Queen, which was used by in the movie Highlander back in 1986, really, really well. I mean, if you've seen Highlander, you know during the opening credits, they blast that tune and you're just like, dude, fuck yeah. Bring on Highlander. I want everything you got for me. And it's so goddamn good. And it's the best use of Queen in a movie, I think. Well, although there's some other contenders. But in this movie, there's a killer sequence where I was like, oh, what a great choice using Princes of the Universe. But then they start chopping it up, and I was like, oh, well, now I'm not enjoying the song. I just want to enjoy the song and watch He-Man and all of his friends kicking the fuck out of people. So the score is a mixed bag, but the original score, I have to say, is pretty goddamn good. But perhaps the most impressive part of this movie is that they managed to hurl the audience into a fully realized universe, like fully populated with all these colorful characters. It is a fictional setting that is living and breathing, and it is working. And you got your various forces at war and so on and so forth. But a lot of franchises will try and fail to build that kind of setting over multiple movies, and this does it. Like right from the word go, right out of the gate, you're just hurled into it. And the scenes on Earth aren't bad. Probably some of the best writing in the movie is when they're poking fun at human resources in this movie. Adam on Earth works in the human resources department of some big company. And if you've ever had negative experiences with human resources in terms of language policing or just like, policing behavior of any kind, and you want to push back on it and kind of, make fun of it a little bit, this movie does successfully poke fun at some of those nauseating impulses. And when I hear stories about companies firing their entire human resources department for creating more problems than they're solving, I'm like, yeah, I get it. Like, you're not alone in that frustration. So I was actually caught off guard that this movie leaned into that. But as far as the mediocre ingredients are concerned, this movie might have had a little bit too much fun with the Easter eggs, and I get it. Between the toys and the action figures and the animated show and the live action, there are a lot of Easter eggs to choose from. But they kind of went nuts. Like, some of them are kind of clever. Like when you see in the trailer when Adam is first trying to reclaim the power sword from that big statue. For people who know about the origins of the He-Man action figure line or the Masters of the Universe line, they'll recognize the original design of He-Man where they take a big gym figure, added a bunch of muscles with clay, and like the original, it was like Tank Head, Bullet Head, and He-Man, I think, were the original three figures that they kind of pitched for this line of action figures. But they basically used that exact original design of He-Man from a bygone era. It's like, all right, that's a legit Easter egg, and I appreciate it. The problem is most of the villains and most of the heroes in this movie all just feel like Easter eggs. Like, oh, it's Mechaneck. Oh, it's Trapjaw. And like, I love all these characters. I played with them for years. I have great sentimental affection for them. But if you were to accuse this movie of basically having nothing but kind of like thin, superficial stereotypes or just like Easter eggs masquerading as characters, most of the villains and most of the heroes in this movie are precisely that. Even Evil Lynn, who's played by Alison Brie, which I thought was very good casting. She's just kind of hamming up and having a little bit of fun, but she never really goes for it like Meg Foster did in the original 1987 Masters of the Universe, where I thought she was one of the best parts of that movie. The chemistry between Meg Foster and Frank Langella was by far the best part of the original movie from 1987. And I think if you just watch those scenes and fast forward through all the bullshit, you can actually have a pretty good experience watching the original movie from 1987. So that was surprising. And Jared Leto as Skeletor, he is better than he's been in quite some time. Like, he's definitely better than he was in Tron Ares, where he was dreadful. He's definitely better than he was in movies like fucking Morbius and all that shit. it's, I would say his version of Skeletor is fine. Occasionally he's mildly humorous, occasionally he's mildly threatening, but they don't really get deep into the psychology of the character, either as kind of a campy villain or as like a scary villain like Frank Langella did in the original 1987 movie. And I guess maybe I've never really fully realized just how impressed I was by Frank Langella in that original movie, but he made me believe in Skeletor even when the rest of the movie was falling to pieces, quite literally, all around him. So I'd say Jared Leto, he was fine, but there's no part of me that's screaming that I need to see 3 more movies starring Jared Leto as Skeletor, the way a lot of people might feel about a villain like Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston or something like that. Now, as far as the weak ingredients are concerned, as I already mentioned, the movie does start to feel overly long and kind of decompressed toward the end at a time where it should be speeding up. But really, my biggest complaint about this movie is about a character whose name I can't even remember, because if memory serves, she's not based on any action figure or any character from any previous iteration, or if she is, I'm unaware of her. But I'm just going to call her Random Man-at-Arms Chick, because there's this girl in this movie who's not particularly attractive, but she's easily the most powerful character in the entire movie, where we don't even know who the hell she is, apart from the fact that she used to like to push Adam into lockers when he was little. But at certain points in this movie, suddenly she starts doing like these martial arts moves. You're like, oh, like we don't need Ram Man and Fisto and Mechanic and Moss Man and Battle Cat and all these other characters. You could just release this random girl boss who no one knows what her name is. No one ever even really talks to her all that much. She's annoying as hell the entire movie, and then only gets more annoying as it basically is revealed that you don't even need He-Man or Man-at-Arms or Teela. All you need to do is release this random character and she'll just kill all the bad guys. But when it comes to annoying girl boss characters in modern day film and television, she is definitely going to become the new poster child. And like any giant nerd who grew up on this stuff, there are certain characters I would have left out and there are certain characters I would have added. Like my version of Masters of the Universe in my own headcanon is perfectly captured in this 1984 poster by William George, which I had on my wall for years. But I love the art. But at that time, the poster captured every single vehicle and like playset and character that was available at that time, 2 years into the franchise. And in my mind, you never need to add any like future characters or anything like that. You can just use those characters and those vehicles, and that's all you need for a successful Masters of the Universe franchise. So I like Triclops quite a bit. I used to fucking love that action figure. Triclops is horribly underused in this movie. If you like Trapjaw, he at least gets a lot of screen time, but once again, not much of a character. And there's some super old school characters like Stratos and Zodek that I would have loved to have seen in the movie, but I get it. You only have but so much runtime, and you can only have but so many villains and heroes on either side. But maybe my second biggest complaint about this movie is the changes to the lore when it comes to the Power Sword. Because in the context of this movie, and I'm going into heavy spoiler territory here, so bail out now if you don't want to hear about it. But in the context of this movie, He-Man is basically a vessel for the power. He is like the chosen champion of Castle Grayskull. So the Power Sword is almost immaterial when he says, like, by the power of Grayskull, I have the power. The power is coming from within, not from the sword. I always loved it in the early days. So whether you were watching the commercials on TV or reading the mini comics in the back or playing with the figures or even watching the 1987 live action movie, whoever has the Power Sword and access to Castle Grayskull, they have the power. They're in charge, and so on and so forth, and they're going to be very difficult to kind of dislodge from that position.
To drive your cursed face from my memory forever! Yes! Let this be our final battle!
What I intensely disliked in this movie is that when Skeletor finally gets his hands on the Power Sword and takes over Castle Grayskull, it doesn't imbue him with any additional power. And that's one of the best scenes in the 1987 live-action version. And I feel like you're kind of doing Skeletor dirty or doing a disservice if you don't give him the means by which he can gain access to that power and become the most powerful, godlike, omniscient, omnipotent entity in the universe. They're kind of defanging him and declawing him at that point. And I just felt like it reduced the power of the ending once I realized that no matter what Skeletor does, he's never going to have access to the power of the Sword of Power. So looking ahead, I really don't know what Amazon should do with this property. We really won't know until we see what kind of audience response there is, because I imagine this movie is not going to be a bomb. It's not going to be a hit. It's just going to kind of exist out there where some people love it, some people dislike it, but it's just going to be like an okay performing movie. And who knows, once it's available on Prime Video, maybe it'll take off, maybe it'll get ignored. I really have no idea how to predict these things. I don't think it's going to spark a lot of kids going out and buying action figures. And speaking of which, I've got my action figure of Stinkor right here, which I bought in 2019 before a lot got, and he still smells terrible. I just got hit by the wave. For people who don't know their action figure history, Stinkor's got these little things on him. Like, apparently the people working in the factory about died. He still smells like shit, and the box has been open for 7 years. And I've got my little mini comic here with the origin of Stinkor, and Bruce Timm actually worked on a lot of those mini comics back in the day. But for anybody who wants to see, when I first opened the Stinkor action figure, I had a live stream back in 2019 where John Cribbs, Adam Rackoff, and we watched one of the very first episodes of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, the episode called Diamond Ray of Disappearance, which I actually think is one of the best episodes of the series, because you have a lot of the heroes, but even more importantly, a lot of the villains featured front and center. And this is going to make me very sad to even mention it. Artist Tony Stella at that time created a thumbnail for the YouTube video just out of the generosity of his heart. And here's the original art that he created, and here's the version as the thumbnail. But Tony, like me, was also a big fan of these characters, and back in the day, and he had his own characters that he was invested in, as you can see in this artwork. But Tony, we miss you, buddy. Your art and your knowledge and your opinions are sorely missed. In any case, I think it's fun to buy the occasional action figure and wave them around, but I don't play with action figures anymore. But I don't anticipate this movie is going to kind of seize hold of the imagination of kids, sparking a lot of action figure sales. Where they could go with the story, a lot of people are going to immediately say, oh, we should introduce She-Ra and the villain Hordak and all that kind of stuff. I worry that if you go down that road, you're going to divide the fan base before it's even fully formed, because there were many factors that led to the demise of Masters of the Universe in 1987, when sales plummeted precipitously. But it was a combination of factors. First and foremost, kids, as they go from age 5 to 10, their interests are going to change very rapidly. Like I said before, I got interested in skateboards, girls, and Nintendo, and I just put all the action figures away. So that was just a natural part of the boom and bust cycle. And of course, they flooded the market with a lot of subpar product. They were just cramming the shelves with all these bland, weird, random characters that nobody gave a shit about, and that was also a big problem. But one of the problems at that time, I think it was 1985, where they introduced She-Ra, and I was like, She-Ra? This is like fucking Barbie. And the original idea for She-Ra was to make it actually tall, like a Barbie doll, because Mattel also creates all the Barbies. I think if they're going to do a She-Ra movie, they should try to do a standalone She-Ra movie with her characters, like, Bo, that stupid guy with the heart, and all of her villains, and see if that works. And if that's popular, then you do your crossover. But you don't make He-Man and the Masters of the Universe Part 2 and then have She-Ra take over the story. Let Teela be the badass. Like back in the day, you didn't need She-Ra because you already had Teela being like, the coolest female character in the lineup by far. In any case, I don't think this movie is going to be popular enough to really excite any sort of like online culture war about the future direction of the franchise, because I have a feeling this movie is going to be enjoyed by some, but it's just going to be like a ship passing in the night, and then Amazon's going to let it go, and that's probably going to be the last that we hear about Masters of the Universe for quite some time. It's not going to be like when Kevin Smith did his Netflix series, and I can remember I got myself totally embroiled in that controversy, because at that time I was so hell-bent upon wanting it to be good, I turned a blind eye to the show's flaws, and I was focusing entirely on the bits that I liked. And there were like a few little scenes scattered throughout that I did like, so I focused on that. People are like, you fucking asshole! How dare you not mention all this other shit that the show's doing? And I totally get it. Message received. But that was a full-blown culture war surrounding at least season 1 of that Kevin Smith show. And he got one more season, and then they let it go. They wrapped it up. I think the reality is, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe is an 80s phenomenon that was insanely fun, insanely cool. It seized the imagination of an entire generation of kids for a few short years, and then it ended. Like in the 1980s, they changed this law in 1981 about whether or not you were allowed to advertise directly to kids, and suddenly we got hit by all these shows that were basically half-hour commercials for toy lines, where whether it was G.I. Joe or Transformers or Thundercats or whatever, we would get hit by these comics/toys/shows where it's like we were just overwhelmed by all these cool fictional settings, and it lasted for a couple of years, and then we all grew out of it. And I just feel like no era of pop culture ever repeats itself, and I just feel like if Amazon wants a new cool fantasy sci-fi franchise that they can turn into a big blockbuster, they should do precisely what Mattel did back in the early 80s. Build it from scratch. Mattel was pissed that they had passed on the Star Wars action figure line and let Kenner make all those millions. Like, shit, we need to have our own Star Wars, and we got to invent it from scratch. Like, we're not going to pay any licensing fees. And they just went out there and they just invented it, and they just did it. So once again, check out the documentaries. Hang on, the titles are The Power of Grayskull, as well as The Toys That Made Us, and that captures the full story really, really well, and all the initial writers and craftsmen that helped invent all these characters in the first place. But I will probably end up seeing Masters of the Universe again at some point if like my nieces or nephews want to watch it. But I'm not going to recommend anybody see it unless you already love the Masters of the Universe, either through the show or the figures or the comics or whatever. If you love this shit, well, then you don't need a review for it. You're already at the theater right now watching it. So it's like this review is almost kind of pointless. But yeah, anyway, I guess at this point, maybe I'm starting to spiral and talk in circles and I'm repeating myself. I think the movie is okay. It's got its good moments, it's got its bad moments, and it's got a few really good moments, but ultimately I don't think it's going to make much of an impression because we got Toy Story 5 right around the corner. We got Spider-Man Brand New Day right around the corner. There are going to be a lot of big heavy hitters coming out in the not so distant future, and the movie that's really got my full attention is Scary Movie 6, which I'm seeing tomorrow afternoon, and I'm fired up to laugh my ass off and review it after the fact. But this review, it's time to bring it to a close. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. But I hope everybody has a great weekend at the movies. But I won't use my usual catchphrase. We just got to say, by the power of Grayskull, I have the power. Anyway, onwards and upwards.